His own driveway had become his neighbor's personal parking spot, and no amount of reasoning or evidence could make her stop. Every time John tried to resolve the issue peacefully, Karen, the HOA president, would smirk and use her authority to paint him as the troublemaker. She was certain her power in the community was untouchable, and his efforts to push back were futile. But what Karen didn't know was that John had been meticulously gathering evidence of her abuses. And when the truth finally came to light, the fallout was nothing short of devastating. How did it all unfold? Let's start from the beginning. John Miller was a man who cherished simplicity and peace. At 40 years old, with 2 kids and a loving wife, he had finally achieved his dream of moving into a quaint suburban neighborhood. The house, with its neatly trimmed lawn, spacious driveway, and a garage big enough for his tools and family's bikes, seemed like the perfect sanctuary. Every morning, he relished the routine, waking up to the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the laughter of his children at breakfast, and the soft chirping of birds outside. Life, for a moment, felt picture perfect. But perfection, as John soon discovered, can be fleeting. It was on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the first disruption to his newfound peace occurred. As he stepped outside to drive to work, he found his driveway blocked by a car he didn't recognize. At first, he thought it might belong to a delivery driver or a visitor to one of his neighbors. Probably just a mistake, he reassured himself. He decided to wait, expecting the car to be moved shortly. After an hour of pacing back and forth, glancing out the window, it finally left without a trace. The next day, however, the same car appeared again, and then the day after that. Soon, it became clear this was no accident. Frustrated, John did a bit of asking around and discovered the car belonged to Karen, his next-door neighbor. Karen, with her perfectly manicured lawn and an air of self-entitlement, was a long-time resident of the neighborhood. She had a habit of asserting herself, often in ways that inconvenienced others. Her reasoning for parking in John's driveway? It saves space on the street, she explained casually when John first approached her. The dismissiveness in her tone stung. She didn't even apologize, brushing off his polite request, as if he were the one being unreasonable. You could almost feel John's blood boiling as he tried to keep his composure. You can imagine the frustration, he later recounted to friends. Your driveway, a space you pay for, maintain and rely on, suddenly treated like someone else's personal parking lot. The days that followed were no better. John, still hopeful for a peaceful resolution, approached Karen again. This time, she cut him off mid-sentence. "It's only for a few minutes each morning," she snapped, waving her hand dismissively. "Don't be so petty." Her words stung deeper than he expected. Petty? Was it petty to expect basic respect for your own property? He could feel the simmering anger bubbling under his calm exterior, but he held back. This was his new neighborhood after all. He didn't want to make enemies, not yet, at least. At this point, even John's children had noticed the daily disruption. "Dad, why is there always a car in our driveway?" his youngest asked one morning. The question, innocent as it was, felt like a punch to the gut. How could he explain to his kids that sometimes, no matter how reasonable you try to be, people will still trample over your boundaries if you let them? And yet, Karen's behavior wasn't just inconvenient. It was a test of patience, of resolve, of how far someone could push before the pushed finally pushed back. Determined to handle the situation calmly, John decided to take a diplomatic approach. Early one morning, before heading to work, he sat down at the kitchen table, the smell of coffee mingling with the faint aroma of toast. With a sigh, he carefully drafted a letter to Karen, his words measured and polite. He explained how her parking in his driveway was disrupting his daily life, making it difficult for him to leave on time for work and setting a poor example for his children. "Surely," he wrote, "a good neighborly understanding would help us resolve this without any unnecessary tension." He folded the note neatly and walked out to her car, still parked in its now regular spot. Slipping the letter under her windshield wiper, he allowed himself a small flicker of hope. Perhaps this gesture would finally make her realize the impact of her actions. But that hope was short-lived. The next day, Karen's car was parked in the same spot as if mocking his efforts. And this time, taped to his front door was her reply, a note written in large, bold letters. The message was anything but friendly. "I've lived here longer than you," it read. I know the neighborhood rules better than anyone. Maybe you should learn to adapt instead of complaining." John couldn't believe the arrogance in her words. How could someone dismiss a genuine attempt at understanding so blatantly? The frustration churned in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Still, he told himself to stay composed. Anger wouldn't solve anything. As the days went by, Karen's behavior only grew bolder. One morning, unable to ignore the issue any longer, John decided to speak to her face to face. Stepping outside, he found Karen watering her plants, humming a tune as if nothing in the world could disturb her peace. Gathering his courage, John approached her, his tone firm but calm. "Karen," he started, "we really need to talk about the driveway situation. It's becoming a bigger issue than it needs to be." But before he could finish, Karen interrupted him, her voice rising enough to draw the attention of nearby neighbors. "Are you threatening me?" she exclaimed, her eyes wide with exaggerated disbelief. "How dare you come to my property and talk to me like this? You're invading my personal space." Her words carried across the yard, echoing like a siren. A few neighbors peeked through their windows, their faces a mix of curiosity and discomfort. John stood frozen, stunned by the sudden turn of events. "Threatening you?" he repeated, his voice low but firm. "I'm just trying to have a civil conversation." "Civil? This is harassment," Karen cut him off, her voice now shaking with feigned indignation. She pointed an accusatory finger at him, ensuring every watching eye saw her as the victim. "I don't feel safe talking to you. Leave me alone." The scene felt surreal, like something out of a bad movie. John could see a couple of neighbors stepping out of their homes, whispering amongst themselves. Some gave him sympathetic glances, but most avoided eye contact, unwilling to get involved. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time, John felt a pang of doubt. How had things escalated to this point? How could someone twist a simple conversation into something so absurd? That night, as he sat on the couch, replaying the day's events in his mind, John couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. "How can someone be so dismissive of another person's rights?" he muttered to himself. His wife, sitting beside him, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure this out," she said softly, but even her words couldn't erase the nagging thought in his mind. Could he really handle this on his own? Looking out the window at the quiet street, John felt a mix of frustration and determination. Karen's actions weren't just about a driveway anymore. They were a challenge to his principles, his sense of fairness. He knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let this go unanswered. Frustration was mounting, and John decided it was time to escalate the issue. Early one Saturday morning, armed with his phone, he documented Karen's car blocking his driveway yet again. He recorded videos, took photos, and even included timestamps to ensure his evidence was irrefutable. Surely, he thought, once the authorities see this, they'll understand how unreasonable this situation has become. The local police station was small and unassuming, with its faded brick facade and a single flag fluttering lazily in the breeze. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of quiet efficiency and the occasional burst of ringing phones. John approached the desk, his heart pounding as he explained the problem to the officer on duty. He laid out his evidence, each photo and video carefully annotated. For a moment, the officer studied the materials, his face unreadable. Finally, the officer sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Look, I understand your frustration," he said, his tone measured but distant. "But this is more of a civil matter. It's not something we can really intervene in. Have you tried contacting your HOA?" John's stomach sank. The words civil matter felt like a dismissal, a rubber stamp on his growing sense of helplessness. "But I have all this evidence," he argued, his voice tinged with desperation. "She's blatantly ignoring my property rights." The officer shrugged, his expression sympathetic but firm. "I get it, but our hands are tied. If it's within HOA jurisdiction, you'll need to bring it up with them." John left the station feeling a mix of anger and defeat. The very system that was supposed to protect him seemed indifferent to his struggle, but the suggestion to contact the HOA was laughable. Karen wasn't just his neighbor. She was the president of the HOA. That revelation alone added a new layer of complexity to an already maddening situation. She wielded her position like a shield, justifying her actions as if they were in line with some unspoken neighborhood code, and with her authority, she silenced anyone who dared to question her. Back at home, John sat at the kitchen table, his phone lying untouched beside a now cold cup of coffee. His wife, always the voice of reason, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "You've mentioned before that other neighbors have had issues with Karen too. Maybe it's time to talk to them." The idea sparked something in John, a flicker of hope, a realization that perhaps this wasn't just his battle. That afternoon, he began reaching out to his neighbors, starting with those who had mentioned their own run-ins with Karen. The stories that came to light were astonishing. One neighbor recounted being fined for a supposed violation that never existed, while another shared how Karen had threatened legal action over a minor landscaping choice. The common thread in their stories was Karen's ability to manipulate HOA rules to her advantage, using her position to intimidate and control. Together, they began pooling their experiences. Some neighbors brought out old letters and fines they'd received, while others shared text messages and emails. Slowly but surely, a picture of Karen's overreach began to form. It wasn't just about blocked driveways or petty fines. This was a pattern of abuse. As they dug deeper, one neighbor unearthed documents suggesting that Karen had even altered HOA guidelines without proper approval. Another produced evidence of financial discrepancies, hinting that funds meant for community projects were being diverted elsewhere. For John, the growing stack of evidence was both a relief and a burden. He wasn't alone, but the fight ahead felt daunting. Late that evening, as the group gathered in his living room, the air buzzed with a mix of determination and anxiety. One neighbor voiced what they were all thinking. "She's gotten away with this for so long because no one's challenged her, but if we stand together, she won't be able to ignore us." John nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Karen might have built her position on intimidation and manipulation, but now, the very community she sought to control was uniting against her. For the first time in weeks, John felt like the tide was beginning to turn. The battle wasn't over, but now he had allies. The morning air was crisp, the sun casting a golden glow over the neighborhood as John stood in his driveway, staring at Karen's car, blocking his path once again. For weeks, he had tried to reason, negotiate, and find peaceful solutions, but every attempt had been met with mockery or outright defiance. Today, however, something inside him shifted. Enough was enough. Clenching his jaw, he pulled out his phone and dialed the number for a towing service. The operator on the other end was calm and professional. "Yes, we can send someone over right away," they assured him. Hanging up, John exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. This was a decisive step, one he hoped would finally make Karen understand that her actions had consequences. The tow truck arrived within minutes, its bright yellow frame gleaming under the sunlight. The driver, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, assessed the situation quickly. "She's blocking your driveway, right?" he asked. John nodded, showing him the legal documentation he had previously obtained from the local authorities. He had done his homework, checked the rules, confirmed his rights, and ensured that his actions were entirely within the law. As the tow truck began to lift Karen's car, the sound of hydraulics filled the air, attracting the attention of nearby neighbors. Windows opened, heads peeked out, and a few murmurs of curiosity rippled through the street. Just as the car was about to be towed away, Karen burst out of her house, her face a mask of shock and indignation. "What are you doing?" she yelled, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. She hurried toward the truck, waving her arms dramatically. "This is illegal. You can't tow my car. I'm calling the police." John remained calm, standing firm with his arms crossed. "Go ahead, Karen," he said evenly. "I've already spoken to the police. Everything I'm doing is completely legal. You've been blocking my driveway for weeks, and I've tried to resolve this peacefully. This is the consequence of your actions." Karen's face flushed with anger as she pulled out her phone and began dialing. A few neighbors had gathered now, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet satisfaction. For some of them, this moment was long overdue. By the time the police arrived, Karen's car was already secured on the tow truck. The officer who stepped out of the patrol car took a moment to assess the scene, his gaze shifting between Karen's animated gesturing and John's composed demeanor. After listening to both sides, he confirmed what John already knew. "He's within his rights," the officer said, his tone firm but impartial. "This is private property, and you've been warned multiple times." Karen's protests faltered, her bravado dimming under the weight of the officer's words. As the tow truck pulled away with her car, she stood frozen in place, her expression a mixture of disbelief and simmering frustration. For John, this wasn't just about reclaiming his driveway, it was a statement. Karen's unchecked behavior had gone on for too long, and this was the first step in holding her accountable. But the ripple effect of this moment was greater than he could have imagined. The neighbors, emboldened by John's stand, began sharing their own stories. Over coffee and quiet conversations, they revealed the ways Karen had used her position as HOA president to manipulate, intimidate, and enforce rules that often seemed to benefit her more than the community. John's actions had sparked something, a collective realization that they didn't have to endure her overreach in silence. Fueled by their shared frustration, John and his neighbors pooled their evidence, compiling a growing dossier of Karen's transgressions, from fines for non-existent violations to unapproved changes to the HOA bylaws. The picture that emerged was damning. Armed with this evidence, John took the next step, filing a formal complaint and seeking legal action. What had started as a personal battle over a blocked driveway was now a larger fight for accountability and fairness. And as John prepared for the challenges ahead, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Karen's reign as an unchallenged authority was coming to an end, and justice was finally within reach. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as John sat at the plaintiff's table, his evidence carefully laid out before him. Across the room, Karen sat rigidly, her confidence noticeably shaken. This was the moment he had fought for, the chance to hold her accountable for the harm she had caused. John's lawyer, Clara, began presenting their case. Evidence of Karen's actions was overwhelming: fines issued without cause, HOA bylaws altered without approval, and funds misused for personal projects. Testimonies from neighbors painted a damning picture of Karen's misuse of power. One after another, they described fines for imaginary violations and threats for non-compliance with non-existent rules. It was clear this wasn't about enforcing fairness. It was about control. When John took the stand, he spoke with quiet determination. He described the frustration, the blocked driveway, and the neighbors' shared struggles. This wasn't just inconvenient, he said. It was deliberate and harmful. Karen's defense unraveled under questioning, her attempts to justify her actions falling apart against the evidence. The judge's decision was clear: all fines annulled, restitution paid to those Karen had wronged, and her removal as HOA president. Furthermore, the HOA was ordered to implement reforms to prevent future abuses. As John left the courtroom, neighbors shook his hand, gratitude in their eyes. The neighborhood quickly began to heal, with a new board prioritizing transparency and fairness. Karen, stripped of her authority, retreated into the background. Every morning, as John backed out of his driveway, he smiled, knowing the fight had been worth it. "No one can take your freedom if you stand up for it," he told his neighbors, his story now a symbol of resilience and justice.